Hi everyone, I am Paul Gabriel Cosme. I am a graduate student in music and composition. Um, and I have the deep honor and great honor of introducing to you our moderator for today. Our moderator is a pioneering ethnomusicologist who did one of the first study, the first I think, study ethnography on the Tausug, the music of the Tausug people in Sur Archipelago in the 1960s up until 1970s, and further studies that goes up until now. He's been in the field for quite a while now and knows the foray of the land. And aside from that, he is also a distinguished performer, musician, and also a dear mentor to many of us. He's also a living treasure of Hawaii. So I have, once again, let me introduce to you Dr. Ricardo D. Chimilios.
Hi, thank you, and thank you, Paul, for the introduction, and hello to the panel. I'm essentially the traffic manager for this event, and what we thought we wanted to do is to have a kind of more informal talk story with a bit of a fictional spontaneity, so that planned spontaneity. So what we hope to do is to sort of talk in general about Southeast Asian studies, its directions, both where it's been, but also where it's going to go. And as you can see from the panel members that have been assembled, there are a range of ages and experiences so that we get a number of different perspectives. And those of you who saw the program, we're following it the order that was presented in the written flyer. We'll start with Miriam Stark, and as the director of Center for Southeast Asian Studies, who will provide sort of the longest perspective, and then we'll go on from one to the other. And each one has 5 minutes, which I'm going to time. Okay. So Miriam, please.
Thanks. Ima, can you put the picture up? Well, thank you. Actually, I have a more shallow level of experience than Krishna does, but I'm happy to talk and thank the Ohana for inviting us all today. What we were asked to talk about was what our work and research is about in Southeast Asia, how we got involved in current research interests, and how my current situation working on issues is related to Southeast Asia. So I wanted to say that my earliest experience was as an undergrad at the University of Michigan because Carl Hutterer, who got his PhD here, was there as a professor, and he was running a project in the Philippines. And I knew people on that project, and I loved the Southwest US, and I loved Southeast Asia. So I was told to find a program for grad school where I could do both, which was a bit of a challenge. But I ended up going to the University of Arizona, and we're about to get there. So, and I went there because there was a professor who'd actually worked in the Southwest and who was running a project in the Philippines called the Kalinga Ethno-Archaeological Project. Could you please advance it? Thank you. I am an anthropological archaeologist, so that can confuse people, which means that most of the time I'm running projects where people go dig, but we also do ethnography, and in this case, the ethnography of material culture. So I was very interested in pottery. Lots of archaeologists do that. And Bill Longacre had a project working in the Cordilleras in northern Philippines with Kalinga communities who had potters. He was welcomed there by Edward Dozier, who was a Tewa Pueblo Native American ethnographer who had been there before. So we came in as sort of like the kids of Bill Longacre. And the reason we went was because pottery was alive and well. Next, please. You can see this. You can see that people cook with pottery. And also people use pottery for water jars. Could you advance it, please? Thank you. It's up in the Cordillera Highlands. It's actually north of the boondocks of Bantan. And these are just some pictures of some potters I worked with as part of the work there. So I fell in love with Southeast Asia through the Philippines, and I'll be honest about that. But then when I got offered the job here, next please, I was invited to work on the East-West Center's Indochina Initiative on the Cambodia side, which was explicitly, click it again please, and one more time, working in Cambodia and specifically with the Royal University of Fine Arts in Phnom Penh. Only 4 archaeologists had made it through into the 1990s, and they wanted to rebuild their program. So I started the Lower Mekong Archaeological Project in conjunction with the Royal University of Fine Arts in 1996. And I would have actually stayed in southern Cambodia the rest of my career, so my daughter got tired of me being away from her. You can see her there in the lower right. But it was a great project with more Cambodian students and interns than foreigners. And we learned a lot about Cambodia's earliest kingdom. The site was big. Next, please. Very big and hard to know. It's called Angkor Parai, and we've written a lot about it. And then I got pulled up, next please, to finally be involved in the Greater Angkor Project, which I also liked, but I told Roland Fletcher, with whom I worked, I'd only do it if I could have a largely Cambodian crew. We worked there for 5 field seasons and had a great time working at a bunch of sites, including Angkor Wat. And I would say, again, one of the highlights was, in this case, being able to bring not only Khmer's, but also graduate students from Southeast Asia who were studying in different universities, so that they could start to get to know each other. I didn't like the idea that I knew all these people and they didn't know each other. So that was a lot of fun. And then after 2015, next please, the other project, I have worked on others, but this is the last one I talk about really, is the Pattaya Cambodia project, where we focus on households, which if you know Cambodian, then you would know Pattaya is household. And this is in Battambang in Northwest Cambodia. And again, we work largely with Cambodian students, but we have worked with non-Cambodians, including Jaratnapa Sernler, who's in the audience. So it's been really a great project. So how I got into my situation was as an archaeologist, but in the 40 seconds I have left, I'll say that that's meant that I've been involved in a lot of heritage work. I do mentoring both formally for my own students and for students across the world, particularly, but not only Cambodians. I also am involved in a series of initiatives with other universities that has to do with trying to bring more equity to the research process for our our Southeast Asia-based colleagues, so that we can have really a much more interesting future. So I've been very honored to have all of these opportunities, and each opportunity spins off into another one. So I'll be in Zamboanga in January, and then Southeast Asians are going to Rabat, Morocco, to work with Moroccan colleagues in February. And it's been a pleasure. And one of the high points for me, next please, has been trying to make things happen. Click again, please. Sometimes if I'm there, like in the upper left-hand corner, but equally if I'm not, whether it's supporting colleagues from the University of Hawaii or colleagues from UCLA and from the University of the Philippines. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope I can keep doing it. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll go on, we'll just go through all of them, and then we'll start the discussion. So our next speaker and member of the panel is Professor Krishna Suryanatha, and she will describe her association and involvement with Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Miriam, because Miriam plays a lot of, like, a big role in my involvement in Southeast Asia, interestingly. So what I want to tell, I'm not as organized as Miriam. I don't have slides to show, and supposedly it's spontaneous talk. So I'm going to tell a story that I was born and raised in Indonesia, and so for the first 30 years of my life, I studied there, and then I also worked there in the rural development area in terms of the theme in Indonesia, in places that I actually knew already empirically. And I was part of a team that often included like American graduate students or foreign researchers who were doing research there. And it was always an interesting situation in which I led the way, introduced to the region, and I had my own story about positionality, but that can go later in some conversation. But generally speaking, they design the questions, they ask the questions, and I sometimes look into that situation. It's like, why are you interested in that question? But I was a research assistant, so we introduced the region. And over a period of about 3-4 years, it started making me feeling like, what if I ask my own questions? And that's what led me to graduate school eventually. And when I went to grad school, I started having a situation in which I felt that the graduate students I used to work with was working on a foreign area. What about if I, as a graduate student, work on another area. I was very familiar with the forests of Indonesia. So I wanted to study in the tropical forest of the Amazon. And obviously, there's a lot more involved. And as many of the Americans who are going to Southeast Asia, language study, I took Spanish because they didn't have any Portuguese here. I started exploring those. And then eventually, I came to a conclusion that learning, like without having to learn the language, without having to go to the research permit, would be the easiest to get my master's. And that's when I started kind of like doing my study in Indonesia. And but in the place where I did my graduate program, area studies were not considered to be the best approach of learning to become a scholar. And it was sort of like themes and concepts were more important than the place. In fact, actually, my graduate committee told me, for the area itself, you are the expert. Like the students, because you come from Indonesia, you are the expert. We're not going to question you about the area studies, but we're questioning you about the approach. So that's how I thought about it. And that's how I actually went about doing my career. I did my dissertations on Indonesia, but when I came here to the University of Hawaii as a faculty member, there are some issues that, kind of like life stages. My children were 5 and 1, and I really didn't want to leave them behind for weeks. I was not like Miriam, who would take her daughter to the field. I was paranoid as a young parent. I was very paranoid about how I'm subjecting them to diarrhea or whatnot of being in the field. So for 20 years of my first 20 years at the University of Hawaii, my work was mostly on agrarian chains in Hawaii, just like looking at places closer to home, which is in some ways it's similar. Like when I was, before my grad school, I was studying my place, but it was taken for granted, empirical details. Now I have a little more concept, a little more lens about like what I'm looking for in my new home. But practicalities, just kind of like, why do you study a region? Everybody is personal. But the concept is what I wanted to always emphasize in my graduate students, whether they want to go to Japan and they just study in Central Oahu. One of my students came wanting to go to Japan, but it's not practical. Let's study Central Oahu, and he got his master's anyway. So that's sort of like my perspective about area studies. And going back to what I said earlier, 7 years ago, 6, 7 years ago, Miriam approached me, how about studying back in Southeast Asia? I said, well, I haven't had any empirical research in Indonesia, but sure, I still have my contact. And so that's when I started joining again. But, and I know my time is up, but I'm just saying that my students usually are working on Southeast Asia as well as the rest of the world.
Thank you. Okay, so we've heard from two of the more sage, the older members of the panel,
Yes.
and now we'll go to the young bucks here, the students. And I like the way in which Ohan has put this together, so that this range of ages and a range of backgrounds, and we'll sort of talk about that in the discussion that will follow. And then after the discussion of the panel, of course, we will then open up for a wider discussion with all of you who are here. So our next speaker is Yiyu Larry Lai, and he will talk about the work that he's doing, and also if you could give a big background of your positionality. Thanks.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So my name is Yu Larry Lai, and I'm from Taiwan. I was like born and raised in Taiwan, and I received my BA and MA degree at National Taiwan University. And I had a training like on Southeast Asian studies in Taiwan, and then after that I decided to come to the US to learn like what kind of area studies they have like this. And so I feel that like, it's interesting to really think about this kind of like a connection or even like disconnection. And so in Taiwan, like when I was like growing up, and then there's a trend like we try to highlight the studies on Southeast Asia and Oceania because we feel that like now we usually like people highlight like relationship between Taiwan and China, and we're like trying to think about the alternative. So the government trying to have lots of the fundings and research projects on that, and really like attracted lots of the students to do these kind of things. And even though I'm not really like influenced by this trend, I was kind of like doing my research before that. And but it's still like impact me a lot because like like there's money, there's projects. And the reason why I started to do this is because of the indigenous activists in Taiwan. And at that time, I noticed because we usually like engage with lots of the activists, and like when I was undergrad students, and then suddenly they told me like some indigenous activists told me that like they actually have a like strong connection and long connection with the indigenous activists in the Philippines in the northern highland in the northern Luzon. And then so I was like curious about this, like why do you like do this? And then especially they shared with me that like they started this kind of engagement since 1980s, and during that time, and both countries were under martial law period. So I was like curious about that, so I followed them to like join their like events, their culture exchange projects. And then after that, I feel that like it's interesting because that like when we talk about these kind of like solidarity networks, especially like international solidarity network, we usually talk about similarities. But when you really like engage in these kind of like cultural exchange projects, more differences you can observe on the ground. So it kind of like make me think about this, like like I really want to know like what is the differences and how it really makes us to have these kind of like transnational connection. So after that, I think it was after 2014, I started to engage with these people and did my master research in the Philippines. And so it's already like 10 years now. And then during this process, I also trying to bring lots of the indigenous youth from Taiwan to the Philippines to also like trying to like let them know the issues and let them know how different like activists in different places trying to mobilize people, trying to learn the issue. So I think it really kind of like makes me want to become a political anthropologist because I feel that like everything is political, and then like when you see these kind of things, it's very difficult to think about like the area studies, especially like from Taiwan. Like Taiwan usually were like regarded as like East Asian countries, and it's like these kind of like cross-regional like connection really make me think about like what is the potential, what is the possibilities for different perspectives on Southeast Asian studies. So I think this is the brief like introduction of my background.
Thank you. And to go on then to our last member here is Reggie. You're going by Chu, who will give us. He's the youngest one. He just finished his comps, so he's in that the first stage there. I see smiles of recognition there, and so he will give us some aspect of his background and perspective as the newbie.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. So, as I listen to everyone here, I have to tell you, even though I'm from the region, I come from Singapore, I really didn't come into Southeast Asian studies or history, which is the department I'm based in, very intentionally. I sort of slipped into it. And maybe let me just start with my positionality. I think as I was listening to everyone, I realized, oh yeah, there's this sense of I know, but I also don't really know my region. And that's partly because I think I grew up in Singapore, very much learning about nationalist histories. I knew the history of my country more than I knew about Southeast Asia. There was this awareness, but to be honest, in a lot of the histories we learned in high school was really very boring history, like political history, military history, history of great men, and it was great because I liked stories, and as with a lot of boys, you grew up with military history. It's like it's cool stuff, it's war. So that got me into history at first. But I think it was also it gradually dawned on me there was no space in these nationalist histories I was learning for my grandmother, which I grew up with, and the nature that my parents would bring me to experience on weekends, whether in the reservoirs or rainforests, well, the smaller patches of rainforests in Singapore. So it wasn't until I went into university and much later, like halfway through my undergraduate, that I realized, there are these other ways to learn about history, and the one that has stuck with me is environmental history. How do we look at if we look at political history, right? It's about how great men have shaped history. But environmental history, you look at things like tigers or mushrooms, how these have shaped history. And so I think when I chanced upon this, I was like, wow, you can actually tell a history of Singapore or the region through an animal. I think made me realize actually that you could actually bring in these other stories and perspectives from all these other angles that didn't just involve all the other approaches that I think we're more familiar with. But with that said, I think so with that also came this background in Southeast Asian history also, not just ASEAN, but the history of Southeast Asia that goes further back. And I think that was, I think it allowed me to understand that there is this region that I'm part of cerebrally. And, I got to travel the region, saw different parts, and got a chance to connect what I was learning in class with what I was seeing when I was traveling. But I think it wasn't until I came into Manoa that I realized, it's strange, right? I think sometimes you have to go out of home to actually realize how much home means to you also. And so when I say home, of course, I mean my country, but also my region. And maybe I'll characterize this space that I'm in as, I think, both oversight and wahana. And oversight in the sense that both, in the history department, when people, Manoa is very well known for its world history and East Asian focus. And I think I realized at that point, nobody really knew about Southeast Asia. When people think of Asia, it's East Asia or just China. And, I think I was very frustrated by that. And it's almost like if I didn't speak up in world history class, nobody would really even know that this place that I came from existed. They would just look at me and be like, oh yeah, I guess you do exist. And I think rage sometimes fuels the things we do. And for me, it was rage and spite. So it was that. But I think it was also the embodied experience of being here in community, in Ohana and family with all these other Southeast Asians that I never got a chance to until now. Being part of this panel, so I think it was that very embodied experience of being part of something bigger, not just as lip service or not just as an idea you write down in books, but being woven into the everyday, things we do, conversations we have, things we like these events that we put together. And I think it's being here that, just listening to everyone and how they approach Southeast Asia. So I think it has made me feel like I'm part of the region a bit more. We can talk a bit more about that later. I've spoken to different Southeast Asians, and I think the one recurring thing is we all don't feel like we're part of Southeast Asia. So maybe we can talk about that later. But I think being here has allowed me to feel more part of the region. So that's me.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks. This has really opened up for where we wanted to go next. I thought we'd sort of start in the middle of things, not too general and not too specific, but the idea of belonging to Southeast Asia. Because in our most sort of decolonial selves, we talk about Southeast Asia as being a construct by somebody else and not by people whose heritages are there. So, as a panel, if you look at the panel, and some of them are from the region, others are sort of from the region, but outsiders in terms of the research they're doing, and then there's Miriam, she's our token Howley, and so that has a different relationship to how one sees Southeast Asia. So could we talk about sort of from the point of view of nationalism as a construct, how is Southeast, how do we see our work being Southeast Asian as opposed to being Singaporean or Philippine or Cambodian or Indonesian? Could we sort of just open that up? And Reggie, you sort of started that. Could you kind of develop that a little bit more?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think this always sits with me. How, because I think so much of us do work that is centered either on our countries or one particular country. So I think the challenge has been thinking of how to put that fragments into a bigger piece. And I think for me, it's, well, with my country, I think with other Southeast Asian countries, they're all very young, relatively speaking. But I think as we all get older, as our countries get older and more confident, I think there is a growing space to put these different histories together, to connect them into, not just one little red dot which I come from, but to see it as part of a broader tapestry. Maybe I think that's roughly where I'm at the moment.
Anybody else just jump in? We're not doing it like.
Well, I can probably speak as a former Indonesian, then current Indonesians, sort of like, do I see my work as just Indonesian studying Indonesia, or Indonesia studying Southeast Asian, or American studying Southeast Asian? Because that's the different roles that I've had. And but certainly, just to study your own home this is an opportunity to really go in depth, because you know intimately that certain things that came from, you're describing the pigment theory. It's like, okay, how is a certain construct occurred? It's because we have been indoctrinated before, and we spoke the language, we know the culture. It's just a lot easier to go in depth from there. But at the same time, I certainly value when I came to UH as a master's student, and then I sort of like, my cohort came from different regions in Southeast Asia as well. And it felt like I felt a sense of belonging to the Southeast Asian region in some ways more than the sense of belonging as Indonesian when I was here. Because I don't know, the Indonesian community is like a given. We'll have cooking together and whatnot. But the Southeast Asian community is kind of like this novelty of being part of like really togetherness. So that was one thing, but that's just like socially. But this recent work as a faculty member later, that I have done the different field school, working with different students from different regions in Southeast Asia, really made me value about this Southeast Asianists, like Southeast Asians studying different regions, just like the way that Larry talked about the comparative, because we had somewhat similar the nation's age of the coming of age after the Second World War, for instance, and the different totalitarian regimes. They're different regimes, but they're all totalitarian. But yeah, it's kind of like that sort of situation. And I really felt, well, my guys here, Maria Musala, the big sponsor of different field schools that we've done, that involve a number of Southeast Asians as well as Americans, who had the opportunity to go to Indonesia, to Thailand, and Cambodia, and how they felt that they are outsider, but they're more insider than only the English speaking, for instance.
Yeah, I can share. So I feel that, like, yeah, I think my case is quite unique, because I think my original observation is more like the actual connection between Taiwan and the Philippines. And after I noticed that, actually, I mean, I would say before I really getting to like the field of like Southeast Asian studies, I saw these kind of like actual connection. And then after that, I realized that, oh, actually, like the area studies, the boundary of area study has their own like limitation. They don't really look like figure out what kind of like actors like kind of like blurring these kind of boundaries. So for me, it's always like thinking about that, like especially like through the lens of like indigenous solidarity networks. And then I noticed that like nowadays, lots of people trying to kind of like, especially like between Taiwan and the Philippines, they try to like restore the historical relation between two countries through the indigenous connection. And then, but people usually use that, like still use the nationalist framework to talk about it. So that's why when they try to restore it, it's still like in a very like different kind of layer. They don't really see the actual thing. Like for example, when people try to restore it, they realize that there are so many different kinds of like misunderstandings when they try to engage with each other, but we don't really talk about it. And then I think this is the thing that I really like to be an anthropologist, because you do like field work. You don't really you do really see these kind of details. And that kind of details kind of like help us to challenge the perspective that like people usually take for granted. So for me, it's like, yeah, it makes me feel that I have like very unique positionality to really think about what area study is, what Southeast Asia studies is, something like that.
About Southeast Asia as a region?
Yeah.
Okay, so to begin with, as the token healthy woman, I start out fundamentally deracinated, partly because of my own positionality, where some of my relatives, I don't know where they were before they were in Minsk, in Prussia, whatever that means, at the turn of the century, running from the Russians. So I don't feel like I have a particular rootedness that I come from. That's number one. Number two, what I loved about Southeast Asia from the beginning is that I was always welcomed. It always felt like a home. And number three, I'm an archaeologist. So like I start with Sunda and Sahul. I don't start with your contemporary nation state boundaries. I totally respect that people have their own histories. And working in Cambodia, that's very important. But I don't see those boundaries as so relevant. So for my research, I'm very interested in the interactions. When I teach about one place, I can only teach about Angkor if I'm teaching about it in relation to what's happening in Vietnam and what's happening in Thailand and what's happening in Indonesia, and maybe the Chola are coming over. There's a lot going on in the region. So I do see it as a region that's intact, but the nation state boundaries really only come into my work in a couple of ways. One way is if there are current conflicts between nation states, that affects who can come work with me in the field or whether we can go certain places, which is a pity. And the other is when I bring students from Southeast Asia, most of them have had the experience that in their home universities as undergraduates, kind of like what you guys are saying, especially what you're saying, that you've only really learned your local history. So there is this process. It's kind of like flowering to say, yes, you went to Silpacorn, or yes, you went to Gajah Mada, or wherever you went, or Royal University of Fine Arts. Now we're going to look at the whole region. And now we're going to look at how the dynamics worked at this broader level. So I don't know if that's helpful to know. I mean, definitely, sorry, one more piece. I do feel a little missionary zeal among the archaeologists in the world because kind of like you were saying about history, Southeast Asia gets left out. Even the Amazon, which I love, by the way, gets more press than Southeast Asia. And so I feel like on the scholarly side of what I do, one of my roles is to take salient themes and research topics in archaeology and bring in Southeast Asian case studies so that people start thinking about it. Partly because it's so cool, and also because the Southeast Asian cases really force us to think more broadly about topics within my field of anthropological archaeology.
That's interesting. I mean, I love your comment about the hospitableness or feeling welcome, because I was thinking of, I see Miriam digging up skeletons and stuff, and these people aren't very hospitable. They're just sort of there. So what it really does show is that the contemporaneity of what is Southeast Asia in this case also really informs the other kinds of things of, in this case, people who are no longer living. And I sort of like the idea because I guess I'm not so much into skeletons, but I'm more into spirits. And those are also part of what the region does for us, I think. The other parts they're not, quote, living in the sense that we think of things as living. And I was very interested in Reggie. He's done 2 articles that I researched. One was on Malayan insects, which do not sort of respect any national boundaries.
Yeah.
And his other study was done on animals at the Singapore Zoo, which are completely bounded. So it was really a nice area of 2 studies, one which is bounded by, in this case, a social and political figure being in Singapore, the other where the insects just sort of go. So could we sort of talk about how the idea of Southeast Asia as a bounded area both inhibits and allows us to do what we do? One of the things you already touched on was visas, of course. But in general, how do we see Southeast Asia as a boundedness that may limit us in other ways, which it's not bounded anymore? Or is it? Because I was, for example, you're talking about Taiwan and the sort of the Austronesian population.
Yeah.
Well, the same thing we can talk about is China and Yunnan. They're all Southeast Asians, they just don't know it. So, how, from a cultural point of view, how do we, do we include them or do we not include them when we're talking about Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I kind of like, it's like very difficult to answer, but I feel that like, yeah, since like in reality or in the contemporary period, like Southeast Asia has already become the region that like, people already talk about in like so many different ways. And this is also what I was trained in Jewish Manoa. Like you can like, cause like people usually said like, I remember like when I was in Taiwan, people usually like trying to like deconstruct ideas of like Southeast Asia as a region. And they're like, oh, this is the concept from like Cold War and blah, blah, blah. And then, but at the same time, you cannot deny that like there's the reality that people already talk about it, and it really make lots of like political effects on it. So how can we really see these kind of like layers? And then like for example, when I trying to do like research in the Philippines, and then like people usually, even though we kind of, I mean, I was like with those like indigenous youth from Taiwan, and then they're like, yeah, it seems that like we have like some similarities, but they still have these kind of like very like ideas about like boundaries, like, oh, but you're still like very different, like, and then that's the thing that like made me really think about this, like how can we, like, I think like people like kind of like sense the ideas of bridging through the differences, and how can we really kind of like academically like analysis these kind of like differences to really think about what region is, something like that. And so I think this is also my like this is still ongoing. I'm trying to like, think about how to kind of like think about it better. But I guess as this is the start for me. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just chime in. Again, this is an answer. Sorry. Not insects, but something just as vexatious, maybe. Every time in Southeast Asian studies, there's always one of the first readings that would be assigned is, is Southeast Asia a real thing or not? And I was so annoyed at it, but I think there is value to getting students thinking about it. But I think what annoyed me was to read world history and realize there have been people who say, it's an invalid category because it's made up. And I think it's annoying because, but at the same time, it goes back to your point. I think thinking about Southeast Asia as a region helps us think more broadly and deeply about issues because all regions are made up to some extent, right? Or these connections, it's what boundaries we draw just depend on how we choose to measure these things. So I think Southeast Asia allows me to think about how these categories are made up. And I think, like Larry said also, there is embodied reality. Like, it doesn't matter if it's made up, like, it's something that people experience every day now. And maybe that experience allows us to not see as either or, like it's made up and therefore it's not real, but maybe it's made up and it's real. And I think it allows us to think of not either or, but both and, that it's both made up and it's both a rose and a unicorn. So we'll go back to Emerson's article.
I'll build on that it's real but it's not real.
Mm.
You know, it's the boundary is there but it's very porous, and it evolves, it just change. And I'm seeing it more as a kind of like, again, that when I'm with Southeast Asians or Southeast Asians, I feel like there are some similarities of concern because I'm a geographer, so looking into just the region, you know, in the tropical Southeast Asia, archipelagic, in most of the island area, and you know, cultural history. So there are some similarities that learning about that landscape makes sense, makes easier sense to students of Southeast Asia, originally from Southeast Asia, or who intend to go to Southeast Asia. So there is some comfort level there. And at the same time, I also don't feel like we can only do that in Southeast Asia, because the concepts that we examine, the processes that we're working through, could be in Southeast Asia, but could also be just like in Hawaii. So that's something that in our work as teacher and students can really help. But I see the Southeast Asian studies as the comfortable level, comfortable space to exercise questions that come up with things that are for our concern.
I don't really have much more to add, except today I was lecturing about the Han Empire and the Parthian Empire, and pointing out that the boundaries really vary through time. And I was thinking about how I have these Chinese national students in my class, and I keep saying that everything south of the Yangtze is really Southeast Asia as far as I'm concerned. So today I was talking about like the culture in Yunnan, and saying like those rivers go straight into North Vietnam, you know, look at the artifacts. So on the one hand, I think that it's very temporally bound, but I also think about how when I bring Southeast Asian students on my projects, you know, and I bring a Filipino student to Cambodia, he's like, oh, you got balut too, you know. It's great. It's like really great, because so there are things that hold together. There are shared values, I think, that really matter. I suspect it could be expanded slightly beyond Southeast Asia, but it's a good, comfortable space for sure. And then for me, at different points in time, you have these different interactional networks. So like, I love the South China Sea, and it does pull all the way to Formosa or Taiwan for us archaeologically, right? So it's a good space to work in.
But a couple of times people talk about belonging. The Southeast Asia is kind of a place they feel they belong, but you did it. You talked about it in a number of senses. One was psychic, and one was emotional, and one was sort of disciplinary. Could we sort of tease that out a little more? How do these imbricate? How do they overlap, or do they overlap each other in your own experience? I mean, is it quote disciplinary, or is it more emotional? What is it that makes us feel that Southeast Asia is the place where we are, where we are at home?
Questions are hard.
You're the ones who brought up these points, and I find them really very interesting, because we use the idea of belonging in a number of different ways here.
But you can belong to multiple homes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask me now, where's home? Home is in Hawaii. But then I long for going back to Indonesia. Then when I'm in Indonesia, I long for coming back here. Or I think the belonging is important because you're most, you're most yourself when you feel you don't have to worry about other perception of you. And I should add probably something about like, I feel like I belong in a lot more places as I age. Not just because I have been to different places, but as I get older. So there's good news. I'm probably the oldest one here. But yeah, as you grow older, you feel like when you talk about hospitality, it's like people are so much more welcoming wherever you are. So I don't know what is that the question that you asked, like whether like how do we feel a sense of belonging?
I mean, how do you feel you belong? And you sort of, I think, answered that. That there are sort of seems to be many stages or many ways of belonging. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you're good.
I wanted to riff off that because I just jotted it down when you first mentioned belonging also, because what is a nation, right? Or what is a country? Does it stop at, for me, the Straits of Johor when I cross the causeway? It's all made up.
Yeah.
To some extent, it's all made up. But I think studying Southeast Asia also got me thinking about home. Is home my neighborhood, the immediate house that I grew up in? Is home my island? Is it my country? Or is it my region? And I think the further out I go, and I think it also echoes with what you said. I think there are many scales and places which we can feel at home. And I think, I don't know, I think being part of Southeast Asia and even being part of my country is to always feel this tension between belonging and unbelonging. So like you said, like when when you're in one place, you feel like going to back to your other home. And I think, yeah, maybe you could apply that to anybody and every place, but I think Southeast Asia, with its very specific geographies and histories and contemporary realities, also, I think it's the both end of belonging and unbelonging.
Yeah, so as a scholar, who is wandering between Taiwan, Philippines, and now Hawaii, I feel that in terms of belonging might be not the exact explanation for me. I think it's more like when I think about my academic or even activist journey, um, I would say I think sharing and bridging it's much more important for me to when we talked about belonging. As I mentioned, there are so many differences. There are so many conversations based on this, and then I realized that as a scholar, sometimes they don't really even though they might also be interested in what your research is, but at the same time, I think most of the time, people are interested in your own experiences, for example, back in Taiwan. And so for me, it's always even though because I want to understand the differences, I really did Philippine studies. But I realized that for most of my academic journey, I have to explain a lot, and then I need to really also know more about the situation in Taiwan, and it makes me feel much more complicated because I do indigenous studies, but I'm not indigenous person. So when they try to ask me about indigenous peoples in Taiwan, I'm not sure if I can really represent this. And then but then I think this is also the key, because I was with those indigenous peoples from Taiwan, and so for me it's lots of my work I did I wrote lots of commentary, I did lots of translation, and then most of my work, even though in the academic circle, it doesn't count as the credit. But for me, it's still necessary because this is the way for me to make people feel that we belong, with we're together, and then we share lots of things. So when I did my research, in the Philippines, in the forest areas in the highland Philippines, and usually people ask a lot of a lot of things about Taiwan. So I also need to do lots of research in Taiwan. And then it makes me feel that like these kind of like knowledge production is quite unique because you know that like specifically, I think in East Asia, people talk a lot about like decolonization and like what is the relationship between the scholars and local people, especially like Western country and like Southeast Asian country. But then for me, I think my personal journey really make me feel that like maybe that's the way for us to really think about what is the belonging regarding Southeast Asia as a region.
I feel like I guess I could bounce some ideas from Larry. I was thinking about how in some ways it sounds like you facilitate and bridge between cultures. I feel like that's something I can sometimes do and I want to do. And as a teacher, especially and as a scholar, I feel like one advantage I have from being based in the US, if I work real hard and I get real lucky, is I can get extramural funding that will allow my colleagues, whether they are students or they are faculty, to get together. And that's really important to me. But that's a role I can play. That's one thing. I was also thinking as you're talking about how I was a little bit young when I did my dissertation work in the Highland Philippines. And I came in, a collection of us students. There was a Japanese student from University of Arizona. I was at University of Arizona, some colleagues, and also Filipinos, mostly from UP. But we did have Ateneo de Manila too, right? So we all came in, but we addressed our professor as Tito Bill, and he was viewed as our uncle, and we were kind of like his kids. And so I chose a village to live in with my friend, who was Filipina, who's at National Museum now, and we were students, and the Kalingas knew we were students, and they'd say, "Come here, Miriam. Come here, Nita. You need to learn this. This is what we do." And that was just the greatest way to live there because they knew we were students. They knew that we were there to learn things. Some things they thought were really esoteric, and the guys could not get it in their heads that we cared about pottery. Like, really. But we did. We did. They were so glad when my boyfriend showed up, they could go drink and smoke cigarettes with him. But anyway, but they would tell us, and the fact that that was my entry point to Southeast Asia was as a student, and I was a student also in. I mean, I was helpful. I learned some medical stuff. I did a lot of basic medical care stuff. But as someone working there as a researcher, I was a student, and that was a very clear. And I was a student of Bill, and then I was also a student that they decided they also needed to mentor, and I was really grateful for that. So maybe that's why I felt belonging. I don't know if this gets back to belonging or not, but and it's true that the skeletons don't say anything, but I would say, Rick, for every time that we do archaeology, honestly, people are so good-natured. We work in their backyards, literally. We work at their pagodas. We are in their faces, and they are so nice to us. They are just incredibly tolerant of us, and so that's why I'm grateful.
No, that's what I was saying, that there is that the living and the non-living, the idea of hospitality. There's a crossover.
But I should also add, and this was new for the people I knew working in Cambodia, because in Thailand I had learned about it. I'd been on a project, and the year before I was there, my girlfriend there, we were working on different units. She had fallen, and she'd gotten a huge gash from a bamboo ladder that didn't work. Anyway, so she got it stitched up. She had a Frankenstein-like scar that we were teasing her about. And she said, "Oh yeah, the Thai workman said that the spirits were mad." And I thought about this. So when I worked in Cambodia, I noticed that the first time I worked there, that my colleague, who was a professor at Royal University of Fine Arts, really very subtly, he just made an offering to the spirit house where we were going to excavate. And after that, I thought, we got to talk to people at the pagoda. And after that, every time we worked, we started with a ceremony. And the ceremony, every place I worked in Cambodia, it involves aja, but it involves monks. And we asked the local spirits for permission. I mean, we don't do it because we don't speak to the spirits, but the aja does that for us. And that's really important. So actually the spirits are part of what we do, right? And I love to hear it when we were at Angkor Wat, the aja there was calling to every part of the Khmer world. It was brilliant. anyway, because apparently we needed a very comprehensive coverage, you know. So, and it's really nice. It's really working. That's what I mean. We're always welcome. In fact, if we're not welcome, I won't work there for sure. Although I don't want to simplify it. Obviously, even in Cambodia, there are layers, or anywhere, there are layers of people who get along, who don't get along. There's power dynamics, and I can largely be outside it because I'm such an alien. But there are times where in the research it's challenging because the higher ups I work with say, oh no, you can work there, and the local people say don't work there. So there's also that.
What brings us to kind of another point that is of interest to me, and a couple of you brought up, is could each of you say something about personally about your own positionality vis-a-vis the research or the work that you do? And I mean, I've essentialized you all, so I'm just waiting to hear how you see yourselves, your positionalities working in Southeast Asia as you do.
I can go first. So yeah, I think the interesting thing for me, like, because I'm like working on the research on of social movement, indigenous movement, and also like how hydropower really influence the indigenous communities in the forest. And I feel that like in the Philippines, this is kind of a very sensitive issue. And so as I mentioned, that like people usually like to want me to share a lot about the situation in Taiwan or other places, and this is one thing for them. Like my positionality make them feel that like they can kind of like learn something from me, or even like trying to figure out what they can really do. So I really need to like conscious about these kind of like positionality, like how I might really influence them. But at the same time, I do really want to provide like much experiences if I can, like something, yeah. And then so this is one thing, yeah. And then for the other thing is that like as I said, like since this is a really sensitive issue, and I think I realized that some local scholars they also share with me that like sometimes they cannot really talk about this, especially in my research areas. There are so many different like indigenous groups, and they also interact with each other. And sometimes, even though they're all indigenous people, but one might like oppress the other. So this is like very difficult for them because like when we talk about indigenous people in general, it's like like they have these kind of like political, like correct, like stance, and then so some people also feel that like as an outsider, I can kind of like contribute, like or even like engage with these kind of like conversations. So I always like conscious about these kind of like power dynamics. So I think this is also one of the reasons why I want to position myself as a political anthropologist, because I feel that like you should really consider these kind of like politics as part of your positioning. So you can kind of like sense like what kind of research you're trying to do or what kind of engagement you're trying to link with your like local interlocutors.
Rick really wants me to state my positionality.
I want it.
Just building on what Miriam and Larry have said about like how being an outsider makes you more embraced even at the first introduction. And we saw that in our field school. In our field school, we have several students who are from Southeast Asia, even when they're not really from that region, but because they look similar. When you enter the door, they kind of like look, it's like nothing exotic, and then they saw someone like, the Howleys or Ariel in some ways, and then just kind of people immediately open up.
More lesbians.
Because they're different,
Definitely
like because in appearance, and they open up right away. So for that first introduction, and as the students myself, like back when I was in my 20s, I always felt uncomfortable because I also have a position that was inferior in Indonesian society. I'm ethnic Chinese, and this is prior to 1998. It wasn't very common to do social science research for ethnic Chinese. there's always some suspicion about like, why are you here? Questions that people ask me, why are you here, was making me as a non-confident researcher very uncomfortable. Then when I moved to Hawaii, and I look like Kama'ainan. I speak different, but at the same time, there's a lot of new migrants in Hawaii that are also similar in this situation. And when I open up, okay, back in Indonesia, I never really opened up because I was afraid to accept. I didn't come, what they call it, out of the closet. Like I didn't want to immediately admit that I was ethnic Chinese for fear of being rejected. But when I'm here, I immediately said, I'm a newcomer. I'm from Indonesia. And people become curious, just like what you said about like, where I came from. And that was so much easier to enter a new research community. But I repeated what I said earlier. As I grew older, plus Indonesian politics also changed, and it was a lot more open about this. As I grew older, and I had a different position, I was bringing students, and some of my former students happened to be already known to the community. And so it's easier for me to enter this situation as well.
Thanks again for being so open. That's very
well, like that's what happened when you're older.
I think bit like Prof. Miriam, I don't have to, or at least because I deal more with dead people and what they've written about. So I think the positionality is not so much front and center. Like I don't engage with people so much. But I think I've realized listening to you also, positionality depends on where you are and what audiences you're speaking to also. So I think it just recently, just finishing my exams, having read a lot of literature about colonial science and stuff, maybe a lot of the work I used to do was very much colonial science built on colonial documents. And I think it was this very strange feeling of reading about how these colonial scientists or officials encounter exotic cultures. And the strange thing is to realize those exotic cultures are mine sometimes. So I think I think in the next bound of my research, as the youngest here, I'm very much a baby still methodologically. But I do really, I think, want to be more conscious about how do I recover the stories that are sort of mine in a way, and how do I reverse these perspectives? And I think it was also, I mean, part of that, the exam I took was also to look at how other Southeast Asian historians like Professor Andayas and that generation have sought to do that. And it goes back partly, I think, to what you said earlier about spiritualities, which is very much in a lot of the conversations I've spoken with Southeast Asian friends here. Yesterday, I was having dinner with Ariel, and we were like, one of the first things we said was, "Is that a ghost? Is there a ghost somewhere in this story?" And I think we are also at a point in, well, at least in both myself and also in the historiography, I think the academic trends where you can start thinking about other approaches and other sources, and that might be an interesting way forward.
You want more? So now I'm thinking about how lucky you are that you're still engaging just not a lot with people, but with your sources. You get to be an old codger like me or Krishna. Actually, when I go to Cambodia, it's just wall-to-wall people. Like I am constantly meeting and having coffee with students and colleagues, and they're telling me I'm hearing a lot of stories. Oftentimes I'm hearing multiple sides of the same situation. I am a teacher, and I am this outside person people can talk to, which is great. So I'll never be Cambodian. I'll never be Filipino, but there is, as long as, and you were talking about this idea of the tension between feeling like you belong and you don't. If you can get comfortable in that liminal space, and I feel like that's where I've been a lot of my life anyway. That's where I am living in Hawaii. I'm not Native Hawaiian. I don't have roots here. try to be very respectful and learn a lot about traditional cultures. I'm not from here. I wasn't from where I grew up. I was born there. It's Gama Aina there because that's where my mom and dad happened to land when my mom was pregnant, you know? And so if you can embrace, for me, that liminality and feel comfortable that I'll never be where I'm living, and that's okay. It's not a problem. Then for me, my main identity in Southeast Asia now is as teacher. And so in Cambodia, everyone calls me Nikru. Even people who are in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who were my students 25 years ago. Like that's who I am. And that's an honorific term, but in exchange, I recognize that brings responsibilities. And those don't stop, like ever with people. So the people I've known 25 or 30 years, they need something that's part of the understanding. Because I'm the group. And if it's someone in the Philippines, it's the same. Anywhere my students are from or my colleagues are from, that's part of my, I guess it's not technically Kuleana. We're having a big discussion in our department about whether you should use Kuleana or if it's Kulina, but it's part of my responsibility and it's my identity. And so for me, belonging has a really different meaning. It's not, I feel like I belong and I have a role, but I'm not from any of those places.
Great. I mean, I think we've sort of come from a rather sort of general discussion to one which is in many ways highly personal, but I think this is also part of why we're all here. And so with that in mind, you've heard us talk now, and I'm sure that you all have personally things of interest that you would like to either to present or to ask the panel. So we're going to open it up to the I suppose only the physical audience, or can we do the online audience? I don't know, or how technologically.
They can
write it and they can read it.
Okay, so if you put it on chat, is it on chat?
Yeah.
Then audio will transmit. So first, let's start with the so-called living present audience. We may get some others after one. To begin our discussion. Yes, thanks.
Hi, I'm Micah. I really enjoyed the discussion. I'm really curious about the answer to the title of today's talk, which is where are we going? We reflected a lot on where we come from and why we do what we do. And I think I'm reflecting on that question for two reasons. The first is like a strategy region. Like how do we bring more people into Southeast Asia? Is it so interesting? Or is it that we find it interesting? Or is this umbrella question of broadening? And I'd be curious your reactions to all of that. And I think the second part of the strategy question is the political question, because the political dynamics are changing so much. Like where are we going with Southeast Asia, given where we've come from?
Can I piggyback on Mike's commentary? So I'm Ben. Hi everyone, nice to meet you. You were talking about where we're going, but I think there's also a distinction between where we're going outside of the region and where we're going inside the region. Because in the region, it seems like there is talk about Southeast Asia, but it's often in the context of something like ASEAN or something like that. So how do you get Cambodians or Vietnamese or Filipinos or Indonesians to be interested beyond just maybe their home countries or their home regions? Like what direction do we think Southeast Asia is getting into, and how do we attract people from outside the region and from inside the region?
Can I put my director hat on
Yes.
for one second? So this is, of course, what we're angsting about, especially since we've just all lost our funding, our federal funding as area studies centers. But just to give Helena Kalenda credit at the Luce Foundation, she was telling us 7 years ago, you need to think about a post-Title VI future and what it looks like. And so I think a couple of points are maybe worth making, and I understand it may be more sensitive for some parts of Southeast Asia than others, but one of the tensions within our centers across the country is to what extent diaspora matters. And so some of my really most amazing junior colleagues have studied diasporic Southeast Asians. There's a role, also what I found just with Cambodia, because I know it there more than any place, when coming back to the Philippines a lot, which is great, is that now the kind of wall that really used to exist between Cambodia and diasporic Cambodians, who were largely part of a refugee population. That wall has come down. When I first got here, it was very hard for Cambodian Americans to envision going back to Cambodia. It made people physically ill with fear. But now the younger generation, they go back and forth. They might live in Cambodia and Phnom Penh. They might go live in Ho Chi Minh City and then come back and live in California. Like, it's much more fluid. And so when we think of Southeast Asian studies, I think we need to open our lens, because it's not just people in Southeast Asia. Although I recognize it brings a lot of tensions here at UH. I'm pretty sure that the locus of tension has been between Philippine studies from the Philippines and Filipino American. But I mean, I'm sure this happens all over. So that's one point. And the other is to think about how to envision area studies, to what extent we're like going to force everyone to drink the Kool-Aid and become area studies, become committed the way some of us are, versus how much can we bring people to the region, which I think all of us have tried to do. Micah, you guys did that most recently with some colleagues. They can be visitors to the region, and maybe they don't work in Southeast Asia later. I used to think, oh, it's another fail. I brought someone and they didn't end up devoting their entire lives to Southeast Asia, but that's okay. Now they know. So those are just some points. I don't know if those really answer either of your questions.
I think I can share, so as a scholar who do research on Southeast Asia studies, I would say, I think this question is I kind of already addressed it a bit in the previous conversations, but I feel that the key is, it's how can we really understand, sharing the knowledge across the region is really important for us to really push this area studies, maybe further more. I don't know. One example for me is that from 2023 to 2024, I was visiting a research affiliate at University of the Philippines, Baguio, and I joined an organization called Indigenous Studies Circle. And it was organized by the grad students from the Indigenous Studies program at that school. And at that time, we started to talk about different kinds of terms, for example, indigeneity, localization, these kind of basic terms. And we realized that local people, local scholars, and even foreign scholars, we talk about we have so many different kinds of perspective and explanation on it. And we started to talk about the differences and the similarities, and trying to figure out then what can we really compromise, or how can we really figure out the new meanings of these kind of terms, and then it can really influence our research on it. So for me, it's I think Southeast Asia has so many rich sources on these kind of potentials, and the thing is that how can we really encourage the scholars outside of the region to know that actually we can really learn more from these kind of sharing, from these kind of conversations, to understand the differences, so that we can kind of use that to kind of revise our perspective and think about different kinds of possibilities. So I think these kind of things, for me as an outsider, I would say it can be a way for us to think about where we're going, in Southeast Asian studies.
Anyone else respond?
Yeah, just briefly say, I think for me, I think it's also very important to have the region, people within the region, scholars in Southeast Asia. And I think that mileage varies depending on the country. Just because I didn't really know much about Southeast Asia, nor therefore care for it until late in my university, in my undergrad. So I think there is also space for for Southeast Asia to be sold to Southeast Asians as well. And I feel I almost miss this whole world that I'm in now, how diverse and interesting it is. And I mean, this is more a policy level kind of issue, but I just feel the way Southeast Asia is being taught in Southeast Asia, I think a lot more can be done, just to talk about how diverse and interesting and weird it is. And right now, I don't know, when I learned it, it was a lot of politics and economics, and that's important, but how are you gonna explain to a 13 or 16-year-old that economics matters? I think there are more interesting ways to sort of sell that to students.
Can I add one more
Sure.
point? Yeah, sorry, Mike, I didn't really answer your question, did I? But so what I think is the way forward has to start with, there's two pieces. One is it has to start with Southeast Asian scholars or students working with foreigners in a relationship of parity. It has to be that. It has to be collaborative. It has to be partnerships. And that's how we should move forward as a field. But I would say, as an archaeologist who's like banging my fist on the table with other archaeologists, that you have to pay attention to the field. Let me give a very short anecdote. I was invited as the outside looking in person to Dumbarton Oaks, which is in Washington, D.C., to stroke my beard and give comments on the origins of civilization in South America. This was 3 years ago. It was very frightening, although I did love the Amazon papers, and it was very exciting to meet these people. Okay, so I said, well, I'm a Southeast Asianist, so I developed this, to me, very elegant perspective on these different themes and topics, and I introduced multiple Southeast Asianists and their concepts of friction and imagined communities and working against states and all of that. They were fine, but when it came to publishing, the editor of the volume said, we don't want Southeast Asia in there. This is about South America. So we have some work to do, right? And it reminded me that we have to, for people like me, as an anthropological archaeologist, I have to ground all my work that's in Southeast Asia in my field. I need to know my area really well, and then I need to do the translational work so that it's relevant to people who don't work there. And maybe that's more of my answer. You're stroking your chin again. Yeah. Oh, Gillian.
Just adding, like, it's on a more modest scale, and also thinking beyond just the United States institutions, because like in Indonesia, some of the universities already started having international programs because it's part of their economic sustainability. Because these are paying students, and the customers are mostly the Southeast Asian citizens in countries in Southeast Asia. And one of our colleagues just went to Singapore starting, and it's kind of like Singapore is always part of that Southeast Asian studies as well too. So in a more modest way, there are seats like that, and I know like in the Philippines, that used to be the only one that Indonesian students who did not go somewhere else would go to, and within the region. Brunei Darussalam is another one that also has been fairly active in trying to do international program. And from what anecdotal, sort of like report from students and former students who had gone through these different short term, sometimes 1 semester, it's like study abroad, but it's within the region. It's very impactful for them, the same way that we feel like I had been privileged to kind of like go to these different places with just like a similar idea, but slightly different context.
There was another, yes. You raised your hand.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gillian. Thanks so much for the conversation and sharing your perspectives, whether they're big intellectual, ideas or very personal ones. I've been loving the conversation about belonging and just thinking about co-belonging and this kind of idea of how we belong to places and we belong to each other and the people that we build relationships with in a place where we do our research or the places that are home for us. But I also, as I think about being situated in place, and I've just really recently arrived here to Hawaii, I'm thinking about, if there's particular things that being situated here in the Pacific do for the ways that you're able to think about Southeast Asia as a region, or maybe because there's such a mass of people from Southeast Asia and coming from the mainland. So just to be able to arrive here at a university that has so many really brilliant Southeast scholars from Southeast Asia. But I I don't know, like when I read Barbara and Leonard and I read about their, all this knowledge about upland, lowland relations and rivers and water and how that connects to like really how us work, right?
Yeah.
Or the concept of Malcolm-Kai, or not the concept of Malcolm-Kai. And so I don't know, what are the ways that being in place here and being on Oahu, how do those experiences shape the ways that you're engaging with Southeast Asia, I guess, when you're there, or it's an idea? And I'll just say that I'll share for myself, my research is in Timor, and I have just, I think for a long time taken for granted that Timor is part of Southeast Asia, and being here is really making me rethink.
It's specific.
Yeah, like, okay, well, maybe I need to think about this more expansively. So that's just to share sort of my personal experience that in the short time that I've been here, it's already making me think more capaciously about how do regions get bound, and how we as scholars like hold on to those different scales of boundaries that help them give us handrails to think about things, right? And hold on to as we're thinking, but also that there's opportunity to think about these intersections between Pacific and Southeast Asia, or in diaspora, and in the region. I don't know, just maybe.
Thanks for the next
here.
hour. Yeah, we're
Sorry.
Good.
Being in place here, and how does maybe how that can shape the way we're thinking about here.
That's a great question, though. Yeah, thank you for that. How do you think of it, all you guys?
Okay, I think I can start. So yeah, I think it's interesting to think about that as a Taiwanese. As I said, like Taiwanese people really try to use the Austronesian discourses to connect Taiwan with Southeast Asian and Oceania countries and islands. And so it's like, like in this kind of like discourses, we kind of like consider Southeast Asia and Oceania as the whole, like a whole a region, something like that, even though it's a very different. So I'm always like struggling with that. And then this is the one thing, like, because I noticed that like there are so many different kinds of like cultural exchange projects, like either in Southeast Asia or Oceania, and people kind of like Taiwanese people kind of like use the same tactics. So for me, it's like I was like looking at this kind of conversations and also the exchange, encounter processes. And on the other hand, I feel that like for me personally, it's interesting for me. I mean, the reason why I choose UH to study is because there's a huge Filipino community here. And then when I decided to think about where to apply for my graduate program, I'm like, oh yeah, because when I was in the Philippines, like people usually like in the north, they usually said like they don't want to use Tagalog because for them it's like the Manila-centric language, so they prefer to use Ilocano because even though the Filipino who use Tagalog, they feel that they're outside. So for me, it's like it's really weird and also unique when I chose to come here and learn Ilocano, even though my Ilocano is still really bad. But like when they realize that you choose to use this language to engage with them, and suddenly like my experiences in Hawaii is like really like make these kind of like closer relationship with them. So I'm still like wondering how it really impact these kind of like different kinds of layers and make my research much more complicated. But I would say, yeah, this is the thing. For me, it's like very interesting to see these kind of dynamics, and I have no clear answer about it for now. But yeah, this is just some thoughts.
Any other responses?
I can probably just quickly on this because like everywhere I went, because Hawaii is my second tenure track job. The first time is somewhere in Colorado. I didn't know anything about Colorado either, but I knew more about Southeast Asia at the time because that's the only background I've had. And but every time you start a job like this, I always thought about like where can I take students for field trip? Because field trips is one way for me to learn along with the students. And also when you introduce yourself to the host, you talk about what you know best, which is like your basic research. And for 9 months, you're just teaching anyway. You don't necessarily have more to gather in terms of data from Timor or from wherever your basic research is going to be. And then after that, then you move to sort of like deepen your research. That's my strategy. And then after a few years, then the research in Hawaii becomes like one of my secondary research, and then it eventually became a primary research because of my conscious choice of not leaving my children behind. So that's just kind of like, I guess it's the sense of belonging. Back to what you said, like if you have a role, you pick a role, what you want to do. That's for that time and place, and then it goes back or away or whatever. It flows.
I wanted to talk about being Chinese here also, because I realized like being Chinese here is very different from being Chinese back in Singapore or Southeast Asia. Because here I would have to say I look like an East Asian here. I think that's the reality. But I would always clarify that I'm Southeast Asian because I just felt like, I mean, it was always very surprising to me when I first got here to see, we can all look so similar, like Chinese people, but we come from so many different contexts. And so I always felt a closer affinity to Southeast Asians. And I think it's that awareness, that greater awareness of being Southeast Asian that has, and that diversity here also that has, I think, made me more conscious of how valuable being Southeast Asian is, whatever that might mean. And so I think that's one thing. The other thing very quickly is I can actually see the sky here. I can see the sunset. Back in Singapore, it's all very densely, towers and very highly urbanized. So I think that sense of like visual space, well, maybe not here, but outside. It's given. I think it has had an effect, and I think it made me realize geographies also shape the ways in which people from different parts of the region might think and imagine how the research they produce.
Okay, we're coming to the end
Is there any online?
of our thing. We have a couple of online questions.
Is that okay?
I wonder if
Sorry,
we could
let's
take them and then we
can
can close.
a
Yeah.
minute. I think one is a target question for Dr. Starr. How has Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization Regional Center for Archaeology and Finance contributed to fostering collaboration and knowledge exchange among archaeologists in Southeast Asia? And second, with funding being slashed in centers for Southeast Asian studies in places like the US, for example, is the honors also academics based in Southeast Asia or to advocate for it? Or is it honors also academic based in Southeast Asia to advocate for it, either at the institution or engaging with policymakers? Then again, area studies in the areas going through sometimes also have to do some level of justification and punching above their weight class to get others interested and invested. Ironically,
But that's all
that's all.
for me.
No,
just the Sameo Spafa I can talk about.
These are two different people.
Okay.
Yeah.
For the Southeast Asian ministers. Sorry?
I said it's an omnibus question.
Yeah, sorry.
It is an omnibus question. So how has Sameo Spafa been helpful? Okay, so for people who are listening to this, I must sing the praises of different archaeologists who've worked for Sameo Spafa, which is the organization based in Bangkok. But Noel Tan has been unbelievable, and he was there for 10 years and was a virtual dynamo who developed our online SPAFA journal and ran SPAFA conferences in addition to training. So SPAFA has, and at other points in its past, has been an extraordinarily important region-based vehicle for training people and bringing people together. I can't emphasize that enough. I have helped where I could in it, we participate where we can, but it's been great. So I think that's the piece I can answer. And what's the role of Southeast Asia-based academics? I think we need to all start working on talking about it together, because the future of Southeast Asian studies is definitely not going to be driven by federal funding. And while the federal funding was great, I think the biggest damage is to language. But while that was great, we just need to pursue initiatives now, even without federal funding, and we need to do it but we need to do it locking elbows and working together. So definitely there will be times when we might ask for advocacy and times when they might ask for advocacy. It just depends on the cause and the time.
Yeah, those are kind of very practical questions, strategy that Michael was asking for that we could sort of perhaps address in as much detail as he would have liked. That's not the reason he left, obviously. Yeah. So unfortunately, we'll have to end here because we're out of time. But I just wanted to point out that the topics that have come up have ranged over a great number of other things, which are, as I said in my email to the panel, are rather rhizomic. They are going to generate other kinds of questions, which I think is really good, so that all the things that we've heard about today and the things that we didn't talk about, I think, come into this idea of why are we as Southeast Asianists here, and perhaps apropos to Micah's concern, how much longer are we going to be around? And that, I think, depends upon each one of us as to how we're going to strategize and how we're going to see the future of what we do in Southeast Asia. So I'd like to have you all thank the panel for being very honest, being very candid.
Thank you for moderating us.
And good luck to Larry and Reggie for the work that is very much ahead of you. And we have closing remarks from the organization.
Yes. First, thank you to all of the speakers and to our moderator for having this wonderful and dynamic conversation about Southeast Asia, where we've been, where we're going, and where we are right now. If you missed parts of it or want to see it again, we will post this in the YouTube channel of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies sometime soon once we properly edit this and the right format. So we have more events in the future, so please stay tuned about what we're cooking up. And that is it. And for the people in the room alive and warm, we also have refreshments on the table. So if you want that, please take them. So thank you so much and hope to see you again soon.
And thank you to all people in the room.
Thanks to the organizers.